They said I had nothing to offer. They had no idea who I really was.
40 guests, one envelope, and the end of the life I thought I had.
She called me a failure. In front of everyone. On our son's birthday.
He thought my life was already his. He had no idea what was coming.
In 48 hours, they would walk into my company and finally learn who I was.
If you've ever been made to feel small by the people who were supposed to love you the most, stay with me until the end, because what happens to Nolan Hale in the next few minutes will remind you that the people who underestimate you are usually the ones who understand you the least. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like this one are only getting started. And you won't want to miss what's coming. Nolan Hale arrived at his son's 7th birthday party, carrying a small wrapped box and the same quiet, unremarkable smile he always wore. He was the kind of man people looked past, not unkind, not unattractive, just easy to overlook. He drove a 5-year-old sedan, wore department store blazers, and worked, as far as anyone at that party knew, in logistics, a phrase that made people nod politely and change the subject. His wife, Vanessa, had stopped asking about his job years ago. His mother-in-law, Carol, had never started. The backyard of the Hale family home in the affluent Maple Ridge subdivision was strung with navy and gold balloons for the occasion. 40 guests mingled beneath string lights that Vanessa had insisted on hanging herself, though Nolan suspected she'd hired someone and simply taken credit. A long dessert table held a 3-tier cake shaped like a dinosaur, because their son Eli loved dinosaurs more than anything else in the world. Nolan watched Eli chase a friend across the lawn, laughing so hard he nearly tripped over a garden hose, and for a moment, Nolan forgot the tension that had settled over his marriage. Like a fog that never quite lifted. He should have known the fog was about to become a storm. It began, as these things often do, with a comment meant to sting quietly, but landed loud enough for the whole yard to hear. Carol, holding a glass of white wine with the practiced elegance of a woman who had never once worried about a grocery bill, turned to a cluster of guests near the dessert table and said, "It's a shame, really. Vanessa deserves so much more than this." She gestured vaguely toward Nolan, the way one might gesture toward a stalled car blocking the road. A few guests chuckled uncomfortably. Nolan felt his ears burn, but he said nothing. He'd learned, over 9 years of marriage, that saying nothing was often safer than saying anything at all. Then Vanessa arrived at the center of the yard, and the party seemed to hold its breath. She was dressed like she was attending a gala rather than her son's birthday party, an emerald dress, hairstyled, makeup flawless. Beside her stood Carol, radiant with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching a plan unfold exactly as intended. And a few steps behind them, moving through the parting crowd like he already owned the yard, was a man Nolan recognized immediately, Marcus Cole, a real estate developer Vanessa had been networking with, or so she'd claimed, for the better part of a year. "Nolan," Vanessa said, her voice carrying easily across the quieting yard. "I think it's time everyone knew the truth." Nolan's stomach dropped. He glanced toward Eli, who was still laughing somewhere near the swing set, blissfully unaware that his parents' marriage was about to be dismantled in front of 40 witnesses. "I've given this family everything," Vanessa continued. And Nolan realized with a sinking clarity that she wasn't speaking to him at all. She was performing for the crowd. "And what have I gotten in return? A husband who can't provide. A husband who works a nothing job while I've had to explain, over and over, why we can't afford a bigger house. Why we can't take the vacations my friends take. Why our son doesn't have what other kids have." Someone in the crowd murmured. Carol stepped forward and with theatrical solemnity produced a manila envelope from her handbag. "We think it's best," she said, loud enough for the back row of guests to hear, "if you sign these tonight. No need to drag this out any longer than it has to be. Divorce papers." At his son's birthday party, in front of 40 guests, half of whom were already lifting their phones to record, Nolan took the envelope. His hands didn't shake, though everything inside him wanted to. He looked at Vanessa, searching her face for some flicker of doubt, some sign that this was a mistake, a cruel joke, anything other than what it so clearly was. He found nothing but cold resolve, and beside her, Marcus Cole's hand settling onto her shoulder with the casual confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. "You've had your chance to be somebody." "Nolan," Marcus said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Some men just aren't built for more than what they've got." The guests laughed, not all of them, but enough. Enough that the sound of it would echo in Nolan's ears for the rest of the night. He looked down at Eli's cake, at the careful blue and gold balloons, at the small wrapped gift still in his hand, and he understood with sudden, absolute clarity that his marriage, the version of it he'd been trying to hold together for years, was already over. It had likely been over for a long time before tonight. Tonight was simply the public execution. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He set the envelope down gently on the gift table, walked to Eli, knelt down, and told his son he loved him and would see him very soon. Then he walked to his car and drove away from the sound of his own humiliation, the laughter of 40 guests fading behind him like static from an old radio. What none of them knew, not Vanessa, not Carol, not Marcus Cole, not a single one of the 40 guests holding up their phones, was that Nolan Hale was not a man working some nothing job in logistics. Nolan Hale was the founder and majority owner of Harrogate Holdings, a privately held investment and acquisitions firm with a portfolio that included, as of 6 days earlier, a controlling stake in Cole Development Group, Marcus Cole's company. Nolan had built Harrogate from nothing over 14 years. Starting with a small logistics software company he'd sold in his 20s, reinvesting every dollar, working anonymously through holding companies and trusted proxies who appeared in press releases and boardrooms so that Nolan himself never had to. It wasn't paranoia that kept him hidden. It was a promise he'd made to himself after watching wealth destroy 2 of his closest friends' marriages and families. He wanted to be loved for who he was, not what he was worth. He wanted his son to grow up grounded, ordinary, unspoiled by money. He had believed, foolishly perhaps, that if his wife loved him without knowing the size of his bank account, that love would be real. He had gotten his answer tonight. In the cruelest way imaginable. 2 days later, Vanessa arrived at her office at Cole Development Group's downtown headquarters, dressed sharply, coffee in hand, expecting an ordinary Monday. Marcus had assured her that with the recent investment the company had secured, promotions were coming, and her position as Director of Client Relations was about to become significantly more comfortable. She'd spent the weekend imagining a bigger house, a corner office, a life finally worthy of the effort she felt. She'd put into pretending to be married to an unremarkable man for 9 years. The all-staff email arrived at 9:04. Vanessa read it twice. Before the words made sense, Cole Development Group had been acquired, fully, controllingly, decisively, by Harrogate Holdings. And the email, sent from the executive office, was signed by the new majority owner overseeing the transition, Nolan Hale. She stared at the screen so long a colleague asked if she was all right. She wasn't, because in that moment, the humiliating scene from Eli's birthday party replayed itself in her mind. Except now she was the one standing exposed in front of an audience, an entire company, board members, investors, while the man she had called a failure walked into the building an hour later, calm, composed, and unmistakably in charge, Marcus Cole met Nolan in the executive conference room with the practiced smile of a man trying to salvage a business relationship he didn't yet realize was already dead. "Mr. Hale," he began, extending a hand that Nolan did not take. "I think there's been some confusion about—" "There's no confusion," Nolan said quietly. "I've read the due diligence reports on your company for the last 6 months, Marcus. I know about the falsified investor documents. I know about the client funds you diverted through 3 shell accounts to cover last year's losses. I know about the NDA you had 2 former employees sign after you threatened their severance. None of that has anything to do with my personal life. It has everything to do with why Harrogate is taking full operational control starting this morning." Marcus's face went the color of old paper. Vanessa, standing near the doorway, felt the floor of her carefully constructed world give way beneath her. "Nolan," she said, stepping forward, her voice smaller now than it had been at the party. "I didn't know. I would never have." "You didn't ask," Nolan said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only exhaustion. "In 9 years, you never once asked what I actually did, where the money for our mortgage came from, or why I never seemed worried about bills that terrified you. You built an entire story about who I was without ever once talking to me. And when Carol and Marcus offered you a version of a life you thought you deserved, you didn't hesitate to humiliate me in front of our son to get it." The room was silent. Somewhere down the hall, an assistant quietly closed a door, unwilling to witness what was clearly a private reckoning happening in a very public place. Over the following weeks, the truth unraveled in full. Harrogate's legal team, working with federal investigators who had already been circling Cole Development Group for 8 months, exposed the extent of Marcus Cole's fraud, falsified financial statements, misappropriated investor funds, and a pattern of predatory acquisitions that had ruined at least 2 smaller companies before Nolan's firm had ever gotten involved. Marcus was placed on administrative leave within a week and formally indicted 2 months later. Carol, who had encouraged the affair from its earliest days and helped orchestrate the birthday party humiliation as a calculated move to push Vanessa toward Marcus's money, found herself estranged from her daughter for the first time in either of their lives, not because Vanessa blamed her, but because the fallout made it impossible for either of them to pretend the plan had been anything but cruel. Vanessa filed for divorce herself, the papers she'd handed Nolan at the party, ironically becoming real. But where she had once imagined a divorce that would leave Nolan diminished, she instead found herself negotiating with lawyers representing one of the most quietly successful men in the state. A man who had every legal and financial advantage and chose, again and again, not to use them against her out of vindictiveness. He didn't fight for the house out of spite. He didn't try to punish her financially beyond what was fair. His only non-negotiable was Eli, shared custody, stability, and a promise that his son would never be used as a pawn in either parent's pride again. "I could destroy you," Nolan told her plainly during their final mediation session. "The way you tried to destroy me in front of 40 people. But I don't want Eli to grow up learning that's how people who love each other behave when things go wrong. I want him to see that his father built something real, quietly, without needing anyone's permission or approval. And I want him to see his father walk away from bitterness, even when he had every right to hold on to it." Vanessa had no response for that. What was there to say to a man who had every reason to be cruel and chose, instead, to be exactly the kind of father and person she had once accused him of never being? 6 months later, Nolan stood in the backyard of a new house, smaller than the Maple Ridge home, but entirely his own, watching Eli blow out candles on a cake shaped like a dinosaur for the 2nd year in a row. There were no 40 guests this time, no string lights hung by someone else's hands, no envelope waiting on the gift table. Just a handful of close friends, a father who no longer had to hide who he was, and a son who had no idea his father was quietly one of the wealthiest men in the state, because to Eli, none of that had ever mattered. What mattered was that his dad showed up every single time. Exactly as he was, Nolan had learned in the hardest way possible that the people who measure your worth by what they can see will never understand the value of what you've built when no one was watching. Real strength, he now knew, wasn't the mansion or the company or the acquisition papers signed with his name. It was choosing, after everything, to remain the same steady, quiet man he had always been. A man who didn't need an audience of 40 guests or anyone else to know exactly who he was. If this story moved you, remember, the people who underestimate you rarely deserve the version of you that finally proves them wrong. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. What would you have done in Nolan's place?